All right, let's dive into the mystery surrounding Banksy. You know, this incredible artist who somehow stayed completely anonymous. It's kind of made him like a legend in the art world. And today, we're going to try to figure out just who he is, what drives him, what his art really means. And luckily, we've got a ton of fascinating sources to help us with this deep dive. We've got stories from folks who knew him back in the day. We've got deep analysis of his artwork, and we've even got some of Banksy's own words about his work and his thoughts.
It really is like piecing together a puzzle, but with
Yeah.
pieces that keep, changing shape. We're not just looking at the art itself, we're trying to understand the mind behind it all, the choices, the intentions.
Exactly. It's not just about pretty pictures, right? So to kick things off, let's go all the way back to Banksy's early days in Bristol. Apparently, he wasn't exactly a model student. There's this story about him getting expelled from school when he was only 9, just a kid,
Yeah.
all because of some incident on the playground.
Yeah, not exactly your typical start for a world-famous artist, right? I mean, it just goes to show, even from a young age, this rebellious streak was there, bubbling under the surface. And you can see how it eventually comes out in his art later on.
And you know, it's interesting. Bristol's graffiti scene was really starting to explode around that same time. And Banksy, as a young guy, he found himself drawn to the Barton Hill Youth Club, which, wasn't your average youth club. This was a place where graffiti wasn't just tolerated, it was actually encouraged.
That's a super important point, though. This wasn't just kids running wild, tagging everything in sight. John Nation, who ran the club, he created a space for legal, community-based art. It was structured, it was collaborative, far cry from the image people usually have when they hear graffiti.
Even then, even as a young guy, Banksy wasn't just another kid with a can of spray paint. There's this story about him, still pretty young, actually convincing a homeowner to let him and a friend paint a mural on the side of their house. Imagine the audacity of that.
I know, right? It takes a certain kind of personality to pull that off. You can already see his charisma, his strategic thinking, traits that definitely would become crucial as his art got more and more attention.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, so now let's talk about the art itself. I mean, everyone knows those iconic stencils, right?
Right.
But he didn't start out that way. He tried his hand at traditional graffiti writing first,
Yeah.
But by his own admission, he wasn't exactly a natural cook.
And that's where the shift to stencils becomes really fascinating. Banksy himself actually talked about how he felt this power in using stencils. It was faster, it was cleaner, and it let him replicate these images so precisely.
He even went so far as to compare stencils to how they've been used in revolutions and wars.
Mm.
I mean, that's a deliberate artistic choice, right?
Absolutely. It's a technique with, this inherent urgency, a kind of built-in political edge. They let you get a message across quickly, powerfully, which, as we know, becomes perfect for the kind of social and political commentary Banksy would become known for.
Speaking of making a statement, do you remember that time he snuck one of his own pieces into the Tate? I mean, the guts it must have taken to do that.
It was audacious, totally. And it perfectly summarizes his whole critique of the traditional art world. He's basically saying that art doesn't need some stuffy critic or institution to give it meaning.
And the best part, the caption he put with it. It can be argued that defacing such an idyllic scene reflects the way our nation has been vandalized by its obsession with crime and pedophilia, where any visit to a secluded beauty spot now feels like it may result in being molested or finding discarded body parts. I mean, talk about dark humor.
Oh, yeah, classic Banksy.
Yeah.
He forces you to look at these uncomfortable truths, but he does it in this witty, almost unsettling way. It's genius.
He did something similar at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, too. His altered portrait of a society lady wearing a gas mask. It was only up for like a couple of hours, but it created a huge buzz.
I remember that, yeah. And the museum spokesperson's response was almost too perfect. They said, I think it's fair to say that it would take more than a piece of Scotch tape to get a work of art into the Met. It's like they completely missed the point.
Yeah, it's like they were almost playing right into Banksy's hands,
Yeah.
but reinforcing this idea that these big institutions are so out of touch, so focused on their own authority, that they completely miss the point of art that challenges them.
Exactly.
So let's talk a bit more about these events he organized, these gatherings he put together, because it seems like he really wanted to bring art to the people, not just keep it locked away in galleries. Right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Walls on Fire was this huge legal graffiti jam. He set it up in Bristol, and he invited like all these artists to just come and paint freely in this designated area. It was a huge challenge to the idea that all graffiti is just vandalism.
That's amazing. What a way to
Very.
change people's perception of the art form, right?
It really was. And then there was Cannes Festival. For that one, he rented out a whole tunnel in London.
Hmm. Wow, a whole tunnel. That's incredible.
He basically turned this grimy underpass into this vibrant art space. He even went as far as to provide like plywood and security so the artists could work without any interruptions.
Wow, he really put a lot of thought and effort into making these events happen.
He did. And they attracted all kinds of artists, even big names in the street art world. These weren't just like art exhibitions, they were statements, statements about creativity and expression, all happening outside of that traditional art world system.
Okay, now I know he's also really known for his critique of advertising, that whole brandalism thing. Can you explain that a bit more, what that's all about?
Well, Banksy sees advertising as this kind of visual pollution, right? It's
Yeah.
constantly bombarding us with messages that make us feel insecure, messages that make us think we need to buy things to be happy. So brandalism is his way of like fighting back. He takes those same advertising messages and kind of twists them to expose how manipulative they really are.
So he's like hijacking their tactics and turning them against them.
Exactly. He takes those familiar ad images, the ones we see everywhere, and he flips them on their head, often with a lot of humor and irony. And it makes us question what's really being sold to us.
I love that. Can you give me an example?
Oh, there are tons. But a great one is that modified Paris Hilton CD he put out. He replaced all her pop songs with like a 40-minute rhythm track. And he changed the whole booklet too. Instead of the original song titles, he put in questions like, why am I famous? What have I done? What am I for?
Oh, wow, that's brilliant.
It's not just art, it's making a statement, starting a conversation.
So we've covered a lot, right? We've talked about his early life, how his art developed, all those stunts he pulled off, those amazing events, and his attack on advertising. I mean, it's pretty clear that Banksy is a force to be reckoned with. But the big question is why? What's driving him? Is it money? Is it fame? Or is there something deeper going on?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the answer is probably a bit of all of it. I mean, there's no doubt that he's achieved financial success, right? His work sells for millions at auction. And he's got companies like Pest Control managing his business interests.
Right. But then there are all those stories about him being uncomfortable with fame. Like, he actually stopped selling new work for a while.
Yeah.
After a show barely legal in Los Angeles got so much attention.
And let's not forget, he goes to crazy lengths to protect his anonymity. I mean, he's got a PR agent who fiercely guards his image. He rarely does interviews and almost never meets anyone face to face.
There's even that story about him asking a photographer to delete a picture, one that just showed the back of his head.
Mhm.
He said, "You have got to get rid of that picture. No one knows what I am like. I am asking you as a mate and as a favor, and will you do that, please?"
It's wild. It's this tension, between wanting his work to be seen to have an impact, but also not wanting to become, a celebrity. And the mystery just adds to the intrigue of it all, right? It lets him operate outside of the system, outside of the traditional art world, which clearly he's got some issues with.
It's like the anonymity allows him to be more pure in his artistic expression. He's not weighed down by personality, by public image.
It's a fascinating paradox for sure. He craves control over his image, but by staying anonymous, he's giving up a certain amount of control. It really makes you wonder if the art would even exist without the mystery.
It does. So it's safe to say he's a complex guy, right? Driven by a lot of different things. But looking at his work, it seems like he's gone from being this art rebel to someone who's really trying to make a statement about social and political issues.
Absolutely. His early work was about aesthetics, about rebelling against the art world. But as he went on, he started tackling these bigger themes.
Can you give me some examples? What issues are we talking about here?
Well, Dismaland is a great example, This dystopian theme park he created in Weston-super-Mare, full of dark humor and social commentary.
Yeah, I remember seeing pictures of that, especially that boat pond. That was pretty unsettling.
It was supposed to be. It wasn't filled with, happy little boats. It was these overcrowded ones filled with, like, figures of migrants, a really stark commentary on the refugee crisis.
And then there's that powerful image of Steve Jobs in the Calais jungle.
Oh, that one's incredible, right? I mean, Jobs, the founder of Apple, was the son of a Syrian immigrant. And Banksy put the symbol of, like, innovation and wealth right in the middle of a place where people were fleeing war and poverty. It's a statement about, the complexities of immigration.
And of course, we can't forget his work in the Palestinian territories.
Yeah, that's some of his most politically charged work. The Waldorf Hotel in Bethlehem, for example. It's right next to the barrier wall, and he calls it the worst view in the world.
He's literally using art to put a spotlight on the conflict.
Exactly. And the hotel itself is filled with his art and work from other artists, too. It's like a space for dialogue, for reflection on the whole Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He's not afraid to tackle these really tough, really controversial issues.
That takes guts, that's for sure. So this brings us to the idea of Team Banksy. We've talked about his PR agent and companies like Pest Control. But how does this all work? Is it really just him, or is there a whole network of people working behind the scenes?
It's another piece of the puzzle, right? There are definitely people helping to produce his work, to promote it, to protect it. I mean, people like Steve Lazarides, his former agent, and Holly Cushing, who's been called his manager. They play really important roles.
I've heard about assistants helping with these big projects,
Hmm.
like Dismal Land and the Waldorf Hotel. I mean, those things are huge undertakings.
Right, exactly. And then there's Pest Control, which handles the authentication and sale of his work, which is huge because there are so many fakes and forgeries out there. It's like this well-oiled machine working in the shadows, keeping the mystique alive and managing the whole business side of things.
It makes you wonder how much control Banksy actually has over his own legacy, right?
That's a good point. And it leads us to another controversy, the whole question of removing and selling his street art. I mean, there's a lot of debate about whether that's right or wrong.
Yeah, some people say it totally goes against the whole idea of street art, right? But others say that it lets more people see the work and can even raise money for good causes.
It's a tough one. On the one hand, his street art is often meant to be part of its surroundings. Taking it out of that context changes its meaning.
There was that huge outcry when slave labor was removed from a wall in London and sold at auction. People felt like it was exploiting a work that was meant to be a public statement.
I get that. I do. It does seem a bit off to think of a Banksy in some, millionaire's private collection, especially when his work is so much about challenging the status quo. But then again, a lot of these pieces are created on private property, so they could just as easily be painted over or, destroyed by weather and time. So maybe removing and preserving them is a way to ensure they last longer, that more people see them.
And Banksy himself has authenticated some removed pieces for charity auctions, which have actually raised millions for good causes.
That's true. So it seems like he's okay with it when it serves a purpose,
Right.
when it goes beyond just making someone rich. But he still refuses to authenticate pieces that are just going to be sold privately.
It's a delicate line he's walking, trying to protect his artistic integrity while also navigating the realities of the art market.
And he's doing it all anonymously, which just adds to the whole intrigue.
Okay, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to go back to that idea of anonymity. Do you think his work would have the same power if we actually knew his true identity?
That's the big question, isn't it? Does the mystery actually make the art better? Or is it just a gimmick?
It's interesting to think about because I'm starting to feel like it's a huge part of what makes his art so powerful. The anonymity lets us, project our own interpretations onto the work, something we wouldn't be able to do if we knew who he was.
I think you're right. And it creates this sense of shared ownership, When you don't know who Banksy is, you focus on what he's saying, not who he is. The message becomes more important because it's not tied to a specific person or agenda.
And it also makes it harder to just dismiss him as, just a vandal or as someone who's just looking for attention.
Right. The anonymity actually gives his social and political commentary more weight. It's not about him, it's about the message.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here, right?
Yeah.
In this first part of our deep dive into the world of Banksy, we've talked about his beginnings, his art, his possible motives, his views, and the huge role anonymity plays in all of it.
It's clear that Banksy is much more than just a street artist. He's this cultural phenomenon, he's a thinker, he's a master of getting people talking.
And in the next part of our deep dive, I'm excited to really dig into Team Banksy and all those controversies surrounding the sale of his work.
There's still so much to unpack, so many layers to this story. It's going to be fascinating to see where it all leads.
Welcome back to our deep dive on Banksy. Last time we were talking about the team behind this mysterious artist, and I think it's a great place to pick up our conversation. It's just wild to think how an artist who's so protective of his anonymity can also rely on like this whole network of people to pull off these massive projects.
Yeah, it's a bit of a head scratcher, isn't it? So let's start with Steve Lazarides. He was Banksy's agent for years, right? I'm really curious to know what impact he had on Banksy's career. Oh, Lazarides was huge. I mean, he was instrumental in taking Banksy from those early street art days to, becoming this global phenomenon. He had this real talent for spotting talent, for marketing. He just understood how to navigate that whole art world scene, how to connect with those high-end collectors.
I've heard stories about Lazaride selling Banksy's work, like out of the back of his car in the beginning,
Yeah.
and then eventually opening a gallery to showcase it all.
Smart move, right. He saw that Banksy's work had this appeal that went way beyond just the street art crowd, and he knew how to cultivate that, how to put on these big exhibitions and attract those high-profile buyers.
But it sounds like their relationship wasn't always, sunshine and roses. There were these hints that they had a falling out.
Yeah.
Like maybe Banksy started to get uncomfortable with all the commercialization, all the attention that Lazarides was bringing in.
Yeah, I can definitely see that happening. There's this story about Banksy getting really upset about a magazine profile, one that focused more on Lazarides than on the art itself. It seemed like he was really wary of, becoming a commodity, a brand to be bought and sold.
That makes sense, especially with everything we've talked about. His anonymity, his desire to control his image. He's clearly not in it for the fame or the money, but for the art and what it represents.
It's a tough balance for any artist, especially once they reach that level of success. How do you handle those market demands while staying true to your vision?
Yeah, it's a question so many artists grapple with. So it sounds like maybe Banksy felt like Lazarides was pushing him too far. Yeah. Towards that commercial side of things.
It's possible. And their split definitely marked a turning point. It changed how Banksy managed his career, how tightly he controlled his image.
Speaking of control, let's talk about Holly Cushing. She's been called Banksy's manager, right? What do we actually know about her role in all this?
Cushing is a lot more mysterious than Lazarides. She's like this behind-the-scenes figure. But there's no doubt she's super influential, involved in everything from, the logistics of those big projects to dealing with museums, legal stuff, you name it.
It sounds like she's someone Banksy really trusts, right? Someone who understands his vision and protects his interests.
Definitely. One source even described her as, let me see, a hard woman, tough, mercurial, and a very good buffer protecting him. She's like the gatekeeper, filtering requests, making sure his voice is heard.
It's interesting to see how her role has grown over time. In the credits for Exit Through the Gift Shop, that documentary about street art, she's listed as Banksy's executive producer.
Which says a lot, right?
It does. It shows how much responsibility she has.
It's a good reminder that even those artists who seem to work alone often have this whole support system behind them.
Right, and it's not just agents and managers, right? There are the assistants, the collaborators who actually help create the work.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Banksy might come up with the ideas, but he needs skilled people to, help him execute them, especially when it comes to those large-scale pieces, those installations and sculptures.
There's a story about him hiring a company, Colossal Media, to paint these, giant rats on walls in New York for his pet shop exhibition.
Right.
But apparently he ended up regretting it. He felt that actually making the art himself was a crucial part of the process.
Yeah, it makes sense. It shows that for him, it's not just about seeing the idea realized, He needs to be involved in the making, the doing, the hands-on part of it.
I like that. And there's that quote from him where he says, I paint my own pictures, but I get a lot of help building stuff and installing it. I have a great little team.
It's definitely a collaborative effort, but with Banksy at the helm,
Yep.
He's the creative force driving it all.
And this all brings us back to the whole question of authenticity. With Banksy's level of fame, there's bound to be tons of fakes and forgeries out there. So it's got to be crucial to have a way to, verify if a piece is the real deal, which is where pest control comes in, right?
Exactly. They're like this authentication service. If you're not sure if a Banksy's genuine, you submit it to them. They check it against their database, They've got records of all his work, and they issue certificates of authenticity for the real ones.
Wow. So they're trying to, keep some order in this market that's probably overflowing with imitations.
I imagine it's a full-time job just keeping up with all the fakes.
Like this constant back and forth. Banksy's trying to disrupt the art world, and the art world's trying to turn him into a product.
It's fascinating, isn't it? This anti-establishment figure who's become a household name. It's a contradiction that just adds to the whole mystique and, of course, his market value.
Okay, so we talked about Team Banksy, but let's move on to those legal battles, those controversies, the ones surrounding the ownership and sale of his work. It gets pretty complicated, right? And raises some really interesting questions about where street art fits into the art market.
Oh, absolutely. It's a minefield. I think one of the biggest issues is that whole question of removing Banksy's street art, taking it away from its original location. There's a strong argument that these pieces are meant to be temporary,
Hmm.
part of the urban environment, and that removing them destroys their intended meaning.
We talked about slave labor being taken from that wall in London and auctioned off. And then there was mobile lovers cut out of a public doorway in Bristol. I mean, those incidents sparked a lot of anger from the local communities.
People get attached to those pieces, especially when they become landmarks, part of a neighborhood's character. It's understandable why they'd be upset.
And then there's that argument that selling these pieces for private profit just goes against the whole spirit of street art, right?
Mhm.
Which is supposed to be about accessibility, about challenging those traditional ideas of ownership.
I get that, I do. But on the other hand, a lot of these pieces are on private property anyway, so they could just as easily be painted over or destroyed. Maybe removing and preserving them as a kind of conservation, a way to make sure they last, that more people get to see them.
And like we said before, Banksy himself has authenticated pieces for those charity auctions, which have raised tons of money for good causes.
Exactly. So it's not like he's completely against the commercial aspect, especially when it benefits something he believes in. But he's still drawing a line when it comes to pieces being sold just to make someone rich.
It's a tricky balance for sure.
He's trying to stay true to himself while also acknowledging that his work has this incredible value.
There was that interesting case in Detroit where a gallery removed a Banksy from a rundown building. They claimed they were saving it from being destroyed, but people accused them of exploitation.
Yeah, that one really highlights all the ethical gray areas around street art and how it fits into the art market. It's a conversation that's going to keep going.
Mhm.
As Banksy gets more famous and his work keeps going up in value.
It's a rabbit hole you could get lost in thinking about it all.
It is. So we've looked at Team Banksy and the whole issue of selling his work. It's clear there's way more to this story than meets the eye.
What's the most fascinating part of all this to you?
I think it's that constant push and pull between Banksy's need for control and his almost embrace of chaos. He's carefully crafting his image, but undermining it at the same time. He's operating in the shadows, but creating work that demands to be seen. It's fascinating.
He's like this walking contradiction, right? Always pushing the boundaries, challenging how we think about art, how we experience it.
Exactly. And he's doing it all anonymously, which just adds to the mystique. Makes you wonder if the art could even exist without that mystery.
That's a really interesting thought. And speaking of mystery, we haven't even touched on one of the most captivating parts of Banksy's work, his social and political commentary.
Oh, we've got a lot to unpack there. In part 3, we'll dive into the messages behind his art and how he uses his platform to engage with some of the biggest issues of our time.
Welcome back to our deep dive on Banksy. We've spent the last 2 parts really getting into his story, from his early days in Bristol to that whole network of people working behind the scenes. But now I think it's time to talk about what's at the heart of it all, the message behind the art.
It's about time, right? It's easy to get caught up in all the mystery and the controversy surrounding him, but at the end of the day, Banksy's art, well, it's about something much bigger. He's making us think, making us question the world around us, and he's doing it in a way that's it's impossible to ignore.
He's not subtle, is he?
Not always.
I mean, we've talked about how his work has kind of evolved, right? From like rebelling against the art world to actually tackling these social and political issues head on. So where do we even start? What are some of the big themes that we see running through his work?
Well, the one that jumps out right away is his critique of authority, especially when it comes to the police and the whole surveillance state. You remember that image of the riot police he did in London? The ones with the smiley faces?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. It's such a simple image, but so striking.
Yeah.
You can't help but question, who's really in control here?
Yeah,
And how power can be hidden behind this friendly facade.
Exactly. He's making us look beyond the surface, think critically about those institutions that are supposed to be there to protect us. And then there's that piece with the CCTV cameras disguised as birds, nesting on a branch. It's so clever and a little creepy, too, when you think about it.
Yeah, definitely creepy.
Yeah.
It's like he's saying, hey, we're being watched all the time, whether we realize it or not. And it's not just the cameras, it's how information is used, how it's controlled to shape how we see things.
That's a good point. Think about those billboards he's altered, replacing ads with these subversive messages. It's like he's taking back public space, using art as a weapon against consumerism and propaganda.
Art as a weapon. I like that.
Right.
But it's not just about, taking down those in power. He's also celebrating ordinary people, right?
Mm-hmm.
Especially those who were marginalized or overlooked. That
Yeah.
image of the girl with the heart-shaped balloon, the one where it looks like she's letting go.
Ah, yeah, that one. What do you think that says?
Hope. I don't know. There's something about freedom. Even when things are tough. It's a reminder that we all have this potential to rise above whatever our circumstances are.
I think you're right. It's a powerful image. And then you've got that one of the boy with the paintbrush just writing, what? In huge letters on the wall.
Oh, that one's great. So simple, but so effective.
It's like he's giving us permission to question everything, Challenge the status quo.
He's certainly making us think, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But he's not always so serious, right? There's humor there, too. This way of finding beauty in everyday life and often poking fun at, like, the absurdity of it all.
Oh, absolutely. Like that image of the monkey wearing headphones and listening to an iPod. It's funny, but it also makes you think about, how technology can isolate us sometimes.
He's got a way of holding a mirror up to us, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Showing us how we interact with the world. And sometimes that humor isn't subtle at all. Like, remember that image of the two policemen kissing?
Yeah, now that one definitely got people talking.
It was such a bold statement about acceptance, about challenging those social norms. But, it's so Banksy. He's not afraid to tackle these tough subjects, these controversial issues. And it feels like, as his career has gone on, he's become even more engaged with these big global issues like war, poverty, the refugee crisis.
You're right. His work in Palestine is a perfect example of that. That walled-off hotel with the barbed wire and what he calls the worst view in the world. It's a powerful statement about that conflict.
And then there's the image of the girl frisking the soldier, right? It flips the whole power dynamic.
It makes you question everything you thought you knew about authority and who has it.
He's constantly challenging our assumptions, making us see things from a different perspective. It's really amazing.
It is, and it's this combination of wit, social commentary, and sheer artistic talent that makes Banksy, he's broken out of those traditional art world confines, He's reached this global audience, and he's making people think, making people talk about things that matter.
And he's doing it all while staying anonymous. It's almost like that mystery allows the art to speak for itself without a personality or a celebrity image getting in the way.
You've got it.
It's been incredible to delve into the world of Banksy. We've explored his journey, his motives, the people behind the scenes, the controversies, and those powerful messages he's putting out there. It's been a real journey for us, too.
It has. I feel like we've only just scratched the surface. But I think we've seen enough to appreciate just how complex and influential this guy is. He's an artist who pushes those boundaries, sparks conversations, and makes us see the world in a whole new light.
He's definitely given us a lot to think about. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I can't help but wonder what's next for him. What new boundaries will he push? What messages will he bring to light?
That's the beauty of it, isn't it? We have no idea. But one thing's for sure, Banksy is going to keep provoking us, keep challenging us, keep inspiring us. He'll keep us guessing, keep us talking, and keep us looking at the world with fresh eyes.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and most importantly, keep that conversation going.